The sun is setting over a ridge in southern England, but the ground isn't green anymore. It's a churned, muddy soup of red. The air is thick with the smell of iron and bowels. On top of the hill, a man lies dead. His body is so mutilated, so hacked apart by swords and axes, that his own mistress will later only be able to identify him by a secret love bite mark on his chest. He isn't just a soldier, he is the King of England. And around him, in a circle of absolute slaughter, lie the bodies of his brothers, his housecarls, and the entire ruling class of the Anglo-Saxon world. This wasn't just a battle, it was an extinction event. In a single afternoon, 600 years of English history were wiped off the map. The language, the laws, the aristocracy, the very soul of the country, all of it died on that ridge. Standing over the corpse is a man they call the Bastard. He's a duke from France who shouldn't be here. He shouldn't be a duke, he shouldn't be alive, and he certainly shouldn't be king, but he has just pulled off the greatest high-stakes gamble in military history. This is the story of the Norman conquest. It is the story of 1066, the most famous year in English history. But it isn't just a story about dates and maps. It's a story about three men: a politician, a pirate, and a predator who decided to play a game of poker with the fate of millions, using armies as their chips. And to understand why that hill ran red with blood, we have to go back. We have to understand the mess that was England in the 11th century. Because the fuse for this explosion wasn't lit in 1066. It was lit 24 years earlier by a man who was terrified of his own wife. His name was Edward. History calls him Edward the Confessor. If you look at the stained glass windows in Westminster Abbey, Edward looks like a saint. Long white beard, pious expression, holding a cross. But in reality, Edward was a disaster. He was an albino, or at least very pale, with white hair and rosy cheeks. He was deeply religious, obsessed with relics, and completely uninterested in the two main jobs of a medieval king: fighting wars and making babies. Edward had spent most of his youth in exile in Normandy, northern France. He loved the Normans. He spoke French. He liked their wine. He liked their haircuts. When he finally came back to England to take the throne in 1042, he brought his Norman friends with him. This annoyed the locals. Specifically, it annoyed the Godwin family. If you want to understand 11th century England, you have to understand the Godwins. Imagine the Kennedys, the Rockefellers, and the Corleones rolled into one family. They were the Earls of Wessex. They were richer than the king, they owned more land than the king, and the patriarch, Earl Godwin, was the man who actually ran the country. Edward the Confessor hated Godwin. He hated him because Godwin had likely been involved in the murder of Edward's brother years earlier. But Edward was weak, and Godwin was strong. So Edward did what weak kings do. He married Godwin's daughter, Edith, to keep the peace. But Edward got his revenge in the bedroom. He refused to sleep with Edith. He claimed it was a vow of celibacy. "I am married to God," he said. But everyone knew it was pure spite. He knew that if he didn't give Edith a child, the Godwin bloodline wouldn't get the crown. He was weaponizing his own infertility to screw over his father-in-law. It was a petty, passive-aggressive move, and it doomed England. Because a king without a son is a ticking time bomb. Fast forward to the 1060s. Edward is old. He's dying. And the question on everyone's lips, whispered in the mead halls of London and the castles of Rouen, is simple: who comes next? There were three answers, and all of them were dangerous. Candidate number 1, Harold Godwinson. After old Earl Godwin died, his son Harold took over. Harold was everything Edward wasn't. He was tall, handsome, charming, and a brilliant soldier. He was the sub-Regulus, the under-king. He had spent years fighting the Welsh, hunting rebels, and running the government. He was English to the bone. If you asked the average guy in a London alehouse who should be king, he'd say Harold. Obviously, Candidate number 2, Harold Hardrada. Hardrada isn't a last name, it's a nickname. It means hard ruler or stern counsel. Harold was the king of Norway, but that title doesn't do him justice. He was a living legend. He was 7 feet tall, allegedly. As a young man, he had been exiled to Russia. He traveled to Constantinople and joined the Varangian Guard, the elite Viking bodyguards of the Byzantine Emperor. He spent years fighting in Sicily, Bulgaria, and the Holy Land. He blinded an emperor. He fought pirates. He amassed a fortune in gold so heavy his ship nearly sank, bringing it home. He was the last of the true Vikings, a relic from a bygone age of berserkers. He believed England belonged to him because of an old, dusty treaty signed by a previous king of Denmark. It was a flimsy claim, but when you have 300 longships and a battle axe, flimsy claims tend to hold up. Candidate number 3, William of Normandy. William was a different beast entirely. He wasn't a politician like Harold. He wasn't an adventurer like Hardrada. He was a survivor. He was born William the Bastard. His father was the Duke of Normandy. His mother was a tanner's daughter named Herleva. In the medieval world, being illegitimate was a stain you couldn't wash off. When his father died, William inherited the dukedom at age 7. His childhood was a nightmare. His guardians were murdered one by one. His tutor was killed. His steward was butchered in the very room where William was sleeping. He grew up running, hiding, and trusting no one. This trauma created a man who was cold, calculating, and absolutely ruthless. He learned that power isn't given, it's taken. By his 20s, he had crushed the rebellious Norman barons. He cut off the hands and feet of men who mocked his mother's low birth. He conquered the neighboring province of Maine. He turned Normandy into a military machine. William claimed that years ago, his cousin Edward the Confessor, remember, Edward loved Normans, had promised him the throne. So, you have the politician, the Viking, and the bastard. A 3-way cage match for the wealthiest kingdom in northern Europe. But the spark that lit the fuse happened in 1064, 2 years before the king died. And it is one of the most controversial events in history. Harold Godwinson, the politician, got on a boat. We don't know why. Maybe he was going on a diplomatic mission. Maybe he was going fishing and got caught in a storm. But he ended up shipwrecked on the coast of France. This was bad news. In 1064, maritime law was basically finders keepers. A local warlord named Guy of Ponthieu captured Harold and threw him in a dungeon, holding him for ransom. Word reached William in Normandy. The Earl of Wessex is in a dungeon. William saw an opportunity. He sent soldiers to Guy with a message, "Give me the Englishman." Guy, knowing better than to mess with William the Bastard, handed Harold over. So, Harold was now William's guest, but let's be honest, he was a prisoner. William treated him well, gave him hawks, wine, weapons, but he wouldn't let him leave. He took Harold on a military campaign into Brittany. They fought together. There's even a scene on the Bayeux Tapestry where Harold pulls to Norman soldiers out of quicksand. They were bros, but then the trap sprung. William brought Harold to the city of Bayeux. He gathered the Norman court. He brought out the small chests covered in cloth. He asked Harold to swear an oath, "Swear that you will support my claim to the English throne when Edward dies." Harold was stuck. If he refused, he would never leave Normandy alive. If he swore, he was betraying his country. Harold looked at the chests. He figured, "I'll swear. It's a forced oath. It doesn't count. I'll say whatever I need to say to get home." He placed his hands on the chests. He swore the oath. I, Harold, promised to keep the realm of England for Duke William. William smiled. He whipped the cloth off the chests. They weren't just boxes. They were reliquaries. They were filled with the bones of saints, holy martyrs. Harold turned pale. In the 11th century, swearing on a Bible was one thing. Swearing on the actual bones of saints was a nuclear contract with God. Breaking that oath meant eternal damnation. William had tricked him. He had coerced the most powerful man in England into signing away his own kingdom. Harold went back to England, furious and humiliated. He told King Edward what happened. The old king allegedly sighed and said, "I told you nothing good would come of you going to Normandy." January 5th, 1066. Edward the Confessor dies. In his final moments, drifting in and out of a coma, Edward reportedly pointed a trembling finger at Harold Godwinson and said, "I commend my wife and all my kingdom to your protection." Wait, did he just name Harold the heir? Or was he just asking Harold to look after the property? It was ambiguous, but for Harold, it was enough. The wit and the council of wise men met the very next day. They looked at the situation. They knew William was in Normandy waiting. They knew Hardrada was in Norway watching. They needed a strong English warrior on the throne immediately. They elected Harold. On January 6th, the day of Edward's funeral, Harold Godwinson was crowned King Harold II in Westminster Abbey. He wasted no time. When the news crossed the Channel and reached Normandy, William was hunting in a park near Rouen. A messenger ran up to him. "Edward is dead, and Harold has taken the crown." William didn't scream. He didn't rage. He sat down on a log and covered his face with his cloak. He sat there 4 hours in silence. He wasn't grieving. He was calculating. Harold had broken the oath sworn on the bones. That made Harold a perjurer, a usurper, a sinner. William stood up. He went back to his castle and started the greatest shipbuilding project since the Romans. He needed a fleet. Normandy didn't have a navy. So he built one from scratch. He cut down forests. He taxed the church. He promised land in England to any baron who would bring ships and knights. But he needed one more thing. He needed moral authority. He sent an ambassador to Rome. He told the Pope about Harold's perjury. He told the Pope that the English church was corrupt and needed cleaning up. He promised that if he became king, he would bring England closer to Rome. The Pope, Alexander II, bought it. He sent William a papal banner, a flag blessed by St. Peter, and a diamond ring containing a hair from the head of St. Peter himself. William wasn't just launching an invasion anymore, he was launching a crusade. Meanwhile, in Norway, Harold Hardrada was getting bored. He was an old man now, 50 years old. He should have been retiring. But then, a visitor arrived. It was Tostig Godwinson. Tostig was King Harold's brother, but they hated each other. Harold had exiled Tostig the previous year because Tostig had been a terrible, tyrannical Earl of Northumbria. Tostig wanted revenge. He went to Hardrada and whispered in his ear, "England is rich. My brother is weak. The people are divided. If you come, I will help you. You can be the king of the North Sea Empire." Hardrada looked at his battle axe. He looked at his ships. He looked at Tostig. "Why not?" Hardrada said. One last adventure. So the board was set. In the south of England, King Harold II mobilized the militia. He gathered thousands of men along the coast. He watched the horizon, waiting for William's sails. In Normandy, William had 700 ships and 7,000 men ready to go. Horses, armor, prefabricated wooden castles. Everything was ready except the wind. For months, the wind blew from the north. A north wind is great for Vikings coming from Norway. It is terrible for Normans trying to sail north to England. William was stuck. He sat on the beach, looking at the weather vane, praying for the wind to turn. His army was getting restless. They were eating through their supplies. In England, Harold waited and waited. May passed, June, July, August. Maintaining a standing army is expensive. The men were farmers. They had crops to harvest. If they didn't go home, England would starve in the winter. Finally, in September, Harold had to make the hardest decision of his life. He disbanded the fleet. He sent the militia home. The summer is over, he thought. William missed his window. He won't come until next year. Harold rode back to London. He thought he was safe, but the universe has a dark sense of humor. In late April of that year, a star had appeared in the sky, a hairy star, a comet. It blazed with a trail of fire, visible even in the daytime. We know it today as Halley's Comet, but in 1066, they didn't know about orbits or ice balls. They saw a sword in the heavens. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle wrote, a portent such as men had never seen before was seen in the heavens. In England, people looked up and trembled. They knew it meant change. They knew it meant blood. They just didn't know whose blood it would be. On September 18th, the blow fell, but not from the south. A messenger arrived in London, his horse foaming with sweat. He knelt before King Harold. "My lord," he gasped. "The north is burning." Harold Hardrada had arrived. The Viking king had sailed up the Humber estuary with 300 ships. He had landed near York. He had smashed the northern earls at the Battle of Fulford. The city of York had surrendered. Harold Godwinson was stunned. He had been watching the south door for a burglar, and the Volf had just smashed through the north window. He had no army. His men were harvesting wheat. His legs were tired, but Harold was a warrior. He didn't hesitate. He sent out the call. He gathered his housecarls, his professional bodyguards, men who wielded massive two-handed Danish axes. He gathered whatever militia he could find on the road, and he marched. He marched north. 185 miles in 4 days. That is an insane pace. That is marathon-level endurance in armor, carrying weapons. He marched day and night, driving his men to the breaking point. He had to catch the Vikings before they could consolidate. He arrived in Yorkshire on September 25th. Harold Hardrada and Tostig were relaxing at a place called Stamford Bridge. They were waiting for hostages from York. They were so confident, so arrogant, that they had left their armor back at the ships. It was a hot day. They were lounging by the river, enjoying the sun. Suddenly, they saw a cloud of dust on the horizon. Then, the glint of steel. Hardrada looked at Tostig. "Is that the hostages?" Tostig squinted. "It looks like an army." It was the entire English host, pouring over the hill like a landslide. Hardrada realized his mistake. He formed his men into a circle to shield wall, but they were unarmored. They were outnumbered. Before the battle began, a lone rider rode out from the English lines. He approached Tostig. "My brother," the rider said, "King Harold sends you a message. If you lay down your arms and return to him, he will restore your earldom. He will give you 1/3 of the kingdom." Tostig asked, "And what will he give to my friend, King Hardrada of Norway?" The rider looked at the 7-foot-tall Viking giant. "He will give him 7 feet of English ground," the rider said. "Or perhaps a little more, seeing as he is taller than most men." The rider rode away. Hardrada asked Tostig, "Who is that man who spoke so well?" "That," Tostig said, "was my brother, King Harold." Hardrada laughed. "If I had known, I would have killed him right there." The Battle of Stamford Bridge began. It was brutal. The Vikings were caught off guard, but they were Vikings. They fought like demons. There is a legend of a single Viking berserker who stood on the narrow wooden bridge, blocking the entire English army. He killed 40 men with his axe. He held the bridge for an hour, buying time for his king to form the line. Finally, an English soldier floated under the bridge in a barrel and thrust a spear up through the planks, stabbing the Viking in the groin. The bridge fell. The English surged across. The shield wall clashed. Axe met skull. For hours, the slaughter continued. Hardrada, fighting without armor, went into a berserker gang to battle rage. He hacked men down left and right, but an arrow struck him in the throat. The giant fell. Tostig refused to surrender. He was cut down. By evening, the Viking army was destroyed. Of the 300 ships that arrived, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. The era of the Vikings in England ended that day in a muddy field in Yorkshire. Harold Godwinson had done the impossible. He had marched across the country and crushed the greatest warrior of the age. He sat at a banquet in York, celebrating. His men were drinking. They were healing their wounds. They had saved England. While Harold was burying the dead in the north, William the Bastard landed 7,000 men, thousands of horses, and his papal banner on the beaches of Pevensey in the south. There was no one there to stop him. William jumped off his boat. He stumbled and fell face first into the sand. His men gasped, an evil omen. They cried, "The Duke has fallen." William scrambled up, grabbing to fistfuls of wet sand. He held them up to the sky. "No," he shouted. "I have grasped England with both hands. And by the splendor of God, it is mine." A messenger rode north. He found King Harold in York, still celebrating his victory over the Vikings. "My king," the messenger whispered, "the Normans are here." Harold looked at his exhausted, battered army. He looked at his wounded friends. He looked south. He had to do it all over again. Harold Godwinson didn't sleep. He didn't rest. He marched. He dragged his exhausted, battered army back down the Roman Roderman Street toward London. 200 miles south, his men were dropping from fatigue. They had just fought a massive battle. They were wounded. But their king drove them on. Why the rush? Harold could have waited in London. He could have let William rot on the coast, starving as winter approached. He could have gathered reinforcements from the Midlands. That was the smart, strategic play. But William knew Harold's weakness. Harold wasn't just a king, he was the Earl of Wessex. The South Coast was his home. The people there were his tenants, his friends, his family. So, William started a campaign of terror. He didn't just invade, he raided, he burned villages. He slaughtered cattle, he destroyed crops. He was essentially torturing Harold's people to bait the king into a fight. It worked. Harold, furious that his lands were burning, decided he couldn't wait. He would smash William just like he smashed Hardrada. He stopped briefly in London to gather more troops, then marched toward Hastings. October 13th, 1066. Harold arrived at a place the locals called Senlac Hill. In Old French, it translates roughly to Sand Lake, but the English word Sandlach meant sandy brook. Later, the Normans would pun it as Sanguilac a Blood Lake. Harold camped on the ridge. He had about 7,000 to 8,000 men. The corps were his housecarl's elite professionals in chainmail, wielding those terrifying Danish axes that could cut a horse's head off in one swing. The rest were the Fyrd, the militia, farmers with spears, clubs, and slings. They were tired, but they had the high ground. The ridge was steep. Harold ordered his men to form a shield wall. They stood shoulder to shoulder, overlapping their shields, creating a solid wall of wood and iron along the crest of the hill. On the morning of October 14th, William marched his army up from Hastings. He looked at the hill. He saw the wall of shields. He saw the English standards flapping in the wind, the fighting man, and the dragon of Wessex. William had a problem. He had cavalry knights in heavy armor on war horses. He had archers. But charging horses uphill into a shield wall is suicide. Horses won't run into a solid barrier. William had to break the wall. He sent his minstrel, a man named Tailfer, out first. Tailfer rode towards the English lines, juggling his sword, singing the Song of Roland, an epic poem about Charlemagne's knights fighting Muslims in Spain. He was taunting them. He killed an English soldier who ran out to fight him. Then, the English cut him down. The battle began at 9 a.m. William sent his archers forward. They fired volley after volley uphill. But the arrows either hit the shields and bounced off, or flew over the Englishmen's heads. The shield wall held. Then William sent his infantry. The spearmen trudged up the muddy slope. The English waited. When the Normans got close, the English unleashed hell. They threw javelins, rocks, and flying axes. The Normans crashed into the shield wall. The sound was deafening, the clank of iron on wood, the screams of men. The English axes did their work. They hacked through helmets and shields like paper. The Normans were pushed back. They tumbled down the hill. Then panic set and a rumor spread through the Norman lines. The Duke is dead. William has fallen. The Norman left flank the Bretons broke. They turned and ran. This was the moment, the decisive moment. The English militia on the right flank saw the Normans running. They forgot their orders. They broke the shield wall. They charged down the hill, screaming, chasing the fleeing Bretons into the marshy ground at the bottom. If William was dead, the battle was over. England was saved, but William wasn't dead. He saw the panic. He ripped off his helmet. He rode in front of his retreating men, his face exposed, his eyes wild. "Look at me," he roared. "I am alive, and by the grace of God, I will yet conquer." His men saw him. They stopped running. They rallied. William saw the English militia who had foolishly charged down the hill. They were out of formation. They were vulnerable. He ordered his knights to turn around. The Norman cavalry swept in. They encircled the English militia in the valley and slaughtered them to the last man. But up on the hill, the housecarls were still standing. The shield wall was thinner now, but it was still intact. Harold was still alive in the center, the battleground on. Noon passed. To PM, 3 p.m., it was a stalemate. The Normans couldn't break the line. The English wouldn't leave the hill. The ground was slick with blood and vomit. Men were slipping on the corpses of their friends. William realized he couldn't punch through. He had to trick them. He remembered what happened to the Bretons. When they ran, the English chased them. So William ordered a feigned retreat. He signaled his knights to charge, fight for a bit, and then pretend to panic and run away. The English, seeing the hated invaders fleeing again, fell for it. Again, they're running. Get them? More groups of English men broke the line to chase the knights. And again, the knights wheeled around and cut them down. It was discipline versus rage. The Normans were professional killers following orders. The English were exhausted patriots running on adrenaline. Discipline won. By late afternoon, the shield wall was disintegrating. It wasn't a wall anymore. It was a series of isolated knots of men fighting back to back. But Harold Godwinson still stood by his standard. As long as the king stood, England stood. William changed tactics one last time. He ordered his archers not to shoot at the English, but to shoot high into the air, so the arrows would rain down vertically on their heads. The sky darkened with arrows. The English raised their shields to protect their faces. But when you raise your shield, your body is exposed to the spears, and then it happened. According to tradition and the Bayeux tapestry, an arrow fell from the sky. It struck King Harold. Some say it hit him in the eye. Some say it hit him in the face. Harold fell. He writhed in agony, trying to pull the shaft out. The Norman knights saw the king go down. They surged forward. 4 knights broke through the housecarls. They reached the wounded king. The English army collapsed. The housecarls, loyal to the end, fought until they were all killed around the king's body. The militia fled into the woods. Night fell. The silence returned to Senlac Hill, broken only by the groans of the dying and the looting of the corpses. William the Bastard took off his armor. He was bruised. 3 horses had been killed under him. But he was alive. He ordered his tent to be pitched right there, in the middle of the carnage, among the dead bodies. He ate his dinner surrounded by the wreckage of the English nation. Harold's body was so mangled that William couldn't identify it. He had to call for Edith Swanneck, Harold's mistress. She walked through the field of blood, turning over corpses until she found him. She identified him by marks known only to her. William refused to give Harold a Christian burial. He guarded the coast while he was alive. William said coldly, "Let him continue to guard it now." He ordered the body buried in a cairn of stones on the cliff overlooking the sea. No cross, no church, just a pile of rocks for the last English king. The battle was won. But the conquest had just begun. William thought the English would surrender immediately. He waited at Hastings for the nobles to come and bow to him. Nobody came. Instead, the surviving English leaders in London, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, elected a new king, a teenager named Edgar the Atheling, the last male of the old royal line. They were going to fight on. William was furious. "Fine," he said. "If they want fire, I will give them fire." He began a march of terror. He marched in a great circle around London. He burned towns. He destroyed Southwark. He burned the villages of Surrey, Hampshire, and Berkshire. He cut off London's food supply. By December, London was starving. The resolve of the English nobles crumbled. They looked at the boiking Edgar and realized he couldn't save them. They looked at the smoke rising from the countryside and realized William would burn the whole world to get his crown. They surrendered. They met William at Berkhamsted. They submitted. They handed over the keys to the kingdom. On Christmas Day, 1066, Westminster Abbey, William walked down the aisle, the same aisle Harold had walked down less than a year before. But the atmosphere was tense. The abbey was surrounded by Norman guards. Inside, the English and Norman nobles were terrified. When the archbishop asked the crowd if they accepted William as king, they shouted yes. In English and French, the noise was so loud that the nervous Norman guards outside thought a riot had started. They panicked. They started setting fire to the houses around the abbey. Smoke filled the church. The congregation screamed and ran out. William was left alone at the altar with a few trembling priests. He was crowned King of England while the city outside burned and his own soldiers rioted. He was trembling, his face pale. It was a chaotic, violent, disastrous coronation. A perfect start to a brutal reign. William was king, but England wasn't conquered. Not really. The North was still wild. The rebels were still hiding in the fens. And the English people were starting to realize that William wasn't just a new king, he was a new owner. They began to sharpen their knives. If you thought the Battle of Hastings was brutal, what happened next was apocalyptic. For the first few years, William tried to play nice. He kept some English earls in power. He tried to learn English, though he gave up because it was too hard. He wanted to be a legitimate king, not just a tyrant. But the English wouldn't let him. Rebellions popped up everywhere. In Exeter, in the fens, led by the legendary freedom fighter Hereward the Wake, but the worst was in the north. The Earls of Northumbria revolted. They slaughtered the Norman garrison in Durham. They invited the King of Denmark to invade. William snapped. He realized that the English would never love him. So he decided they would fear him. He marched north with his army. But this wasn't a military campaign. It was a scorched earth operation. It was a genocide. History calls it the harrying of the North. William ordered his soldiers to spread out across Yorkshire and the surrounding counties. Their orders were simple: destroy everything. They burned every village. They burned every farmhouse. They slaughtered every sheep, cow, and pig. They smashed the plows. They burned the seed grain for the next year's harvest. They hunted people down in the woods like animals. The result was a famine of biblical proportions. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis, who was actually half English and usually tried to be fair to William, wrote about it with horror. He said that people were reduced to eating cats, dogs, and even human flesh. He estimated that 100,000 people died of starvation. Bodies lay rotting on the roads because there was no one left to bury them. For a generation, the north of England was a wasteland. When the Doomsday Book was written nearly 20 years later, entry after entry for Yorkshire simply read, Hoc est wast, this is waste. William had broken the back of the English resistance. He had turned the north into a graveyard to protect his crown. Or Derek Vitalis wrote, I have often praised William in this book, but for this act I can say nothing good, for he barbarously slaughtered those who were guilty and innocent alike. For this he will be punished by God, with the rebellion crushed. William set about reshaping England in his own image. This wasn't just a change of management, it was a total replacement of the ruling class. Before 1066, there were about 4,000 English thanes nobles who owned land. By 1086, there were only 4 left. William took all the land in England and gave it to his friends. 50% of the country was owned by just 200 Norman barons. The king himself owned 20%, the church owned 25%. The rest was scraps. He built castles. This is the most visible legacy of the conquest. Before the Normans, England didn't really have castles. They had burhs fortified towns. The Normans built motte and bailey castles everywhere. A big mound of earth, the motte with a wooden tower on top, and a courtyard, the bailey below. They built them in the middle of towns like London, the Tower of London, York, and Lincoln. They were symbols of occupation. A giant stone middle finger to the local population, saying, we are here, we are watching you, and you can't touch us. He changed the church. He fired the English bishops and replaced them with Normans. He built massive stone cathedrals, Durham, Winchester, Canterbury in the new Romanesque style. They were huge, heavy, and imposing. They were designed to make the English feel small and the Norman god feel big. And he changed the language. For 300 years after the conquest, the King of England didn't speak English. The aristocracy spoke French. The peasants spoke English, Old English. The church spoke Latin. The French words trickled down. This is why English is such a weird, beautiful mess of a language today. The English peasant raising the animal used the Germanic word cow, sheep, pig, deer. The Norman lord eating the animal used the French word beef, boeuf, mutton, mouton, pork, venison, venison. Without William the Bastard, Shakespeare doesn't happen. The richness of the English vocabulary comes directly from this collision of cultures. But William didn't care about linguistics. He cared about control. In 1085, William was old and fat. He was in Gloucester for Christmas. He had a deep conversation with his advisors. He wanted to know exactly what he owned. It was the ultimate IRS audit. The English were terrified. They called it the Doomsday Book, the Book of Judgment Day, because there was no appealing its verdict. It showed a conquered land. It showed a land where the English were now second-class citizens in their own country. In 1087, William was fighting yet another war in France because the French king made a fat joke about him, calling him a pregnant woman. William was riding through the burning town of Mantes. His horse stepped on a hot coal and bucked. William was thrown violently against the high pommel of his saddle. The impact ruptured his intestines. He was taken to a priory in Rouen. As he lay dying, he was reportedly terrified of hell. He confessed his sins. He admitted he had treated the English badly. He gave money to the poor. He died on September 9th, 1087. And then the indignity began. The moment he took his last breath, his servants panicked. They looted the room. They stole his weapons, his silver, his clothes. They even stripped the king's body naked and left it on the floor. When they finally tried to bury him in Caen, the funeral was a disaster. A local man interrupted the ceremony, shouting that the church was built on land William had stolen from his father. "I forbid you to bury the robber in my ground," the man yelled. The bishops had to pay the man off right there in the middle of the funeral. Then came the body. William had grown very obese in his later years. The stone sarcophagus they had prepared was too small. The gravediggers tried to force the body in. They pushed, they shoved, and then the body burst.